The various access hatches on a fuselage can actually be one of the most difficult things to re-scribe, especially freehand. However, this can be made a lot easier through the use of metal template. Make sure that you choose the right size using a sharp, small pointed scriber. On the first pass around, just go around softly because you're really just trying to make the outline. Then on each successive pass, you can use more pressure and more force. But at every stage, really push up against the metal template. The scriber is actually running along the edge. You're actually using it to keep the pressure on. I then use a blunt scriber to actually go around and clean out the channel. Follow this process and make sure you do every hatch, because it's very important to make sure that all the panels are done so everything looks consistent. When re-scribing panel lines, if they're not well established and if there's a bit of a break or a significant break between them, it's really important to use a guide, because it can be quite difficult to maintain a straight line consistently, and you really do need to have a straight line. By far the most effective guide that I've been using is the thick plastic tape that comes with the Dynamo electric labelers. This is a very stiff plastic. However, after usually one, maybe two panels, the edge does become dented, so you have to either swap sides or get a new strip of tape. As before, you should use a sharp needle-like pointed scriber. Essentially what this does is it scratches the plastic. After you remove the tape, you can then decide whether you feel it's sufficiently deep. The adhesive on the tape is actually very strong, and it allows you to wrap around complex curves. When doing the panel lines around the nose cone, it's advisable to do it in small sections at a time, generally something around the quarter of a radius mark, just because it's difficult to get the tape to actually line up and stay straight along the whole edge. It will tend to curve a little bit out one way or the other. This is mainly due to the fact that the nose is tapered and it's going inwards, so you're not actually getting a parallel set of lines every time. And if doing it for the first time, or if you're not quite sure, then do it in smaller sections, maybe even half that again. But as your confidence grows, it's possible to do larger sections each time. When re-scribing panel lines along the areas that you have used extensive putty, you need to take extra care. The main reason for this is sometimes the putty can be quite crumbly if pushed down too hard. So you really want to do lots of little gentle scratches that gradually and very delicately eats away at the putty. Again, it's better to actually underdo it than to overdo it in this particular case, because obviously having to redo any of the putty is going to be very hard. But you can actually get a really good result with just a little bit of patience and gentle finesse. If you've never actually done any re-scribing in the past, or if you're actually quite reluctant to try it, then I'd recommend at the very least trying it out on the join where the two fuselage halves meet, both on the bottom and on the top. This is where the majority of the sanding normally occurs, so at the very least you should be able to rejoin the two panel lines. Generally speaking, there shouldn't be too much of a break there, so it should, in theory at least, be one of the easiest panel lines to re-scribe. And that's why I would recommend to actually start there. And obviously the actual middle join where the wing root is, it can be one of the more difficult ones, so perhaps that's one of the ones that you actually leave last. But again, the more you try, the more you practice, the better results you should be getting. Once all the panel lines have been re-scribed, you often still need to actually smooth out the edges of each of the panel lines, because many of the scribers don't necessarily leave a clean, rounded edge, and when you're putting the ink washes in later on, it can be a little bit patchy and not consistent, which can then distract from the eye. So one of the best tools I use is actually a Tamiya scriber. This is a V-shaped head on the actual scriber. When you lean it to one side, it will scrape that side, and then you lean it to the other side in order to scrape that. Use very gentle pressure, you really don't need to use a lot, and it will just give it a nice clean edge. Often there's very little point in doing a very nice job on all the panel lines, only to have the rivet detail fade off and then pick up again across some of the panel lines, which obviously happens when you sand an area back. Therefore, it's actually very important to make sure that the rivet detail is actually restored. And if you want to be bold and adventurous, you can always add rivet detail where it should be present, but it's not, as not every kit does a fantastic job of recreating all the rivets. One of the best tools is finding a scriber that essentially has a needle point to it. So it's like a bigger needle, and you can get various different sizes, and all you need to do is use it as a punch. So you just go through and line up with the holes that you can clearly see, and then the holes that are slightly faded, and just re-punch them. If there are areas where the detail has been sanded back to such an extent where you no longer can see where the rivet holes are, then it's a matter of trying to keep the spacing consistent to the way that it was where the rivet detail was visible. So sometimes this requires a little bit of guesswork, which you can get wrong. But again, with a bit of practice, and if you want to be really pedantic, you can actually measure them out using a ruler. But generally speaking, just make sure that you try and maintain consistency, both in spacing and also in depth. So the amount of pressure that you actually use on the needle tip, you want to try and keep that as consistent as possible. The other method of re-riveting is using a riveting tool. These are simply just a wheel with lots of little stubs. They come in different sizes, so you need to first match up the distances between the current rivets you've got on the aircraft with the distance on the actual riveting tool. Generally speaking, they're actually quite accurate. There's a good selection, depending on the brand you choose obviously, but generally speaking, there should be sufficient coverage for all the scales available. This tool is very effective if you have patches where there are no rivet detail at all, or alternatively if there's no rivet detail on the aircraft in the first place. Because the one downside of this tool is that it's actually quite difficult to line up the faded rivets, or even rivets that are actually still quite prominent, with the tool itself. So you run the risk of double riveting in certain places if you don't get the alignment correct. And again, just like with describing, you can use one of the plastic tapes as a guide, and really you do need to use a guide because sometimes the wheel can go off center, then obviously you've got a row of rivets that is not lined up properly, and it can really look very distracting to the eye. In certain parts of the airframe, there are some larger rivets. The most prominent places where this occurs is along the wing root, sometimes along the cowling as well. And often a actual punch style re-riveting method is insufficient because you'll either go too deep or you won't get the right width of the rivet that you need. So the best way to do these is to actually use a pin vise with a very small drill piece. Make sure that you line up the size of the drill piece correctly with the size of the rivet holes that you need to do, and then just simply drill out each one. That's all for this episode of Scale Model Cinema. I hope you enjoyed it and will join us again in the future. Check out other videos at scalemodelcinema.com or like us on Facebook. Cheers.